Thank you for braving the cold weather and getting here. Finally, we have winter here in Michigan again. This is great. Lovely. A little bit cold in single digits, but we're starting a brand new series called Material World. There are two things you could possibly mean when you say that. One is, if you're a scientist, you mean the material world, the physical world, the things that are around you. The other, if you're Madonna, you mean materialism world, and that's what we're talking about right there. We live in a materialistic society. We do. It's a reality that we interact with all of the time. You may be familiar with this photo of this cup right behind me. This is a picture of a special edition Stanley Cup, not the hockey kind, but the Stanley Cup that has just gone crazy this past season. I don't know what happened, but it came out of nowhere. Everyone wanted one of these cups, you know. And I'm still a Yeti guy myself, but they're very nice. And this Valentine's edition hit the shelves, and I'm told in many stores across the country sold out in 3 minutes. People stampeding. There's all sorts of videos on social media of people like running into the store and, you know, pushing people out of their way and trampling each other and whatnot to get their hands on these cups. And then, you know, of course, many of them take them home and they're like, I don't really want it. I'm going to sell it on eBay, and they sell it for 3 or 4 times as much as what they paid for it. Everyone felt like they needed to have one or they were going to get left behind. I'm not sure what the mentality was behind that, but it basically just shows us, it's one small illustration from these past couple of weeks of how we live in this material world that it surrounds us. It's just this idea that is pervasive in our culture, in our world, in the Western world. Now, it's very difficult to live in a space, in a culture, in a world, and not be influenced by something that is as pervasive as materialism is in our culture. There's probably a handful of areas of things in our culture, because sometimes culture can be neutral, sometimes it can be good, sometimes it can be bad. But when it comes to certain things like this, where it's just everywhere, and the messaging is constant, and I think it continues to get more and more, we continue to get inundated more and more with this type of thinking. So it's very difficult to live in this kind of world, in this kind of culture, and not be influenced by it, not be formed by it, you might say in sort of New Testament biblical terms. We are being formed constantly by the inputs that we bring in, that we take in. And one of the things that we're constantly taking in is the materialistic mindset as we approach our daily needs, as we approach shopping or needs or wants, you know, as we approach just our entire lives. What gives us value, what gives us meaning, what gives us security, what gives us comfort, what makes us feel powerful, what makes us feel worthwhile, what makes us feel like we have value ourselves. All of these things are impacted by this idea of materialism in our world, but we don't even see it. On a day-to-day, you could go through a whole day and experience it literally hundreds of times, if not more, and not even realize you're experiencing it. There's a thinker, an author named David Foster Wallace, passed away, but very influential in our culture in many ways, and observed things and wrote about them and thought about them and talked about them. One time during a commencement speech, he told this kind of joke story. He said, there are these 2 young fish swimming along. They happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the heck is water?" They don't even realize the environment that they're in. You know how that can work sometimes? Like, you live in a certain space. Like, for me, it's wherever I set up my workspace, because ever since, 2020, I work from home right now. Someday maybe I won't be working from home. But right now I work from home. And everywhere I go, you can ask my wife, a pile of books follows me. And I don't like to work just in one place. I work in multiple places in the house. So there are piles of books that I leave behind everywhere I go. And so books and papers and whatever, you name it. It just follows me, and it's a mess. Now, when I sit there among the pile of books and whatnot, I don't even notice that it's there. So I'll get up at the end of a workday, and there'll be open books still sitting on a table or on a couch or wherever I was last working, and I don't even notice that it's there. But my wife does. She notices, but we don't even notice the stuff that we become accustomed to that surrounds us. It's like, what is water? I don't know what water is. It's just where I exist. It's just the world that I've come to expect, not even realizing that that's what I'm swimming in. So we experience this. Now, Jesus, he has a lot to say about this sort of mindset throughout the New Testament, throughout the Gospels, and other authors as well. Old Testament, plenty more there. But we're going to be focusing primarily during this series, and we'll go to some other passages, but we'll be launching off from mostly passages where Jesus is speaking to us about this mentality, about materialism, about how we should view things and wealth and whatnot that we have in front of us, and how we can be counterformed. So we are being formed by the messaging of our world, and sometimes when there's a message and a formation happening that's as pervasive as this, we need what people call counterformation. We need counterformation. We need a special level of interacting with God through His Spirit where He can form us, not only just form us into what Jesus wants us to be, but first unform us, just deform us out of what we have been taking shape with when it comes to our culture. When you think about Romans 12, Verse 2, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world. There's a very famous verse, you may be familiar with it. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Sometimes we need to deconform before we can be transformed. So this is counter-formation. And we see Jesus talking about these topics quite a bit. One of such instance happens in Luke chapter 12. He tells a parable to a crowd. It's called the parable of the rich fool. I'm going to read starting in verse 13, which sets it up. He's teaching in front of a crowd. It says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." He's setting up this parable, and he says a couple of really direct truths that are in extreme conflict with what we experience hundreds, maybe thousands of times a day through marketing, advertising, social media, just wherever our eyes and our focus goes. We see this all around us. You can't drive down the freeway without seeing multiple advertisements. You can't watch a show or listen to the radio or scroll on your phone without being advertised to. We are constantly receiving an opposite message. He first talks about greed. He says, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Did you know there are many kinds of greed? I don't know what exact categories of greed that there are that exist, but sometimes we think of greed as being one sort of insidious, heinous thing that you can recognize when you see it, and it's something that really stands out. But I think there's all kinds of greed. I think greed can hide and lurk in the corners of our hearts, and we may not even realize that we have ways of justifying ourselves, but it's lurking in the background. We experience greed. And we house greed sometimes in our hearts without realizing it. But what really is greed at the end of the day? Greed is something that seeks possessions. And Jesus says right here that's not equivalent. It's not the same thing as true living. Stuff, when it comes to greed, stuff can become a substitute for the proper object of our search and the proper object of our worship, which is God Himself. Greed can become, and a desire for things and for wealth can become a substitute for that. So therefore, Paul calls greed idolatry outright 2 times in the New Testament. Colossians 3:5, Ephesians 5:5. Greed is idolatry. It's idol worship. It's worshiping something other than God because it takes place, it substitutes in our hearts something that we really want to experience, want to have, and our search and our worship becomes after stuff, after money. And that's what we pursue. So that's what really Jesus is getting at when he says, watch out for all kinds of greed. Greed is idolatry. Greed is our heart not being faithful to God. We're seeking out possessions. We recognize this. We see it in Scripture, but even sometimes some non-Christian contemporary cultural critics recognize this as well. They recognize idolatry in our culture and equate the materialism of our society with idol worship or with worship in general. There's an anonymous graffiti artist in the UK named Banksy. Well, that's what he goes by. He's anonymous, so nobody knows exactly who this person is. And he's constantly critiquing culture through his work. A lot of stuff that maybe we wouldn't agree with, but sometimes he has some astute observations, such as this piece right here. It says, "Sale ends today." That's the title of the piece. He's got a series of them. And then next to "Sale ends today" in front of it, you see these sort of Renaissance-looking figures lamenting the idea that the sale is going to end today. Now, if you pay attention to art at all, which I'm trying to do more and more of, because I think we just learn so much about the human heart, about ourselves through art. The Renaissance art would maybe draw figures just like this in a certain type of painting. Typically, it would be a painting where Jesus is on the cross, and there's a group of people lamenting his death, not knowing what will come next. And so in a not so subtle and very sarcastic way, in a sense, almost crude, he's saying this is how our culture views materialism. It's like a worship. It's a devotion. It's a devout commitment to consumerism. Pointing out to us what our gods are today. I think it's a good commentary. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a little crude, it's a little harsh, but it's the reality of how some of us at times, how we get caught up, how we can tend to live our lives. The idea that life does not consist in the abundance of possessions is the exact opposite of the message that we receive day in, day out. It's in direct conflict with the message of our world. And it's that message, the opposite message that our world gives us, that life does consist in an abundance of possessions. It's so pervasive that almost everybody recognizes it, even though we haven't figured out how to deal with it in our own hearts, in our own lives. Almost everybody recognizes it. And in surveys, 95% of Americans characterize most of their fellow Americans as materialistic. 82% agreed that most of us buy and consume more than we need. Why the difference between those two figures? I think there's 13% who don't see it in themselves. So when you add the us to it, it eliminates them from the equation. But most of us still do. We still see this in ourselves. So I probably don't need to even do as much of a sales pitch as I'm doing right now to get you to agree and come along with this idea that we live in and are often influenced by the materialistic world that we are surrounded by in the day in and the day out. Jesus carries on in this interaction. It says, and he told them this parable, verse 16. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. This is what we are seeking and what we're told we are supposed to seek, the abundant harvest. That's what we want to pursue. That's what we go after, the abundant harvest. We want abundance in our bank accounts, abundant spaces in our homes, abundance of items in those spaces, abundance of luxury vehicles in our garages. It's been equated with sort of the modern American dream. It somehow grew out of just making it and being able to get to a place to provide for your family to having it all. And whatever that image is of having it all is a constantly moving target. A lot of times people say, I will have it all when I have this. And then they get there and they're like, I will have it all when I have this. And they just keep elevating the level and on we go. That's how our hearts work oftentimes. When we're trying to worship something that's a counterfeit, that's how it works. We get there thinking it's going to satisfy and it doesn't do it. Jesus carries on in verse 18. Then he said, this is what I'll do. This is the man talking, the man who had the abundant harvest. He's like, I don't know where I'm going to put all my crops. So this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. This mentality, Jesus is pointing out, a very similar mentality what we might have today. Instead of barns, we might rent storage units or build a third car garage or whatever. And I'm not trying to be too harsh on anybody. If you have a third car garage, I don't mean that to be like, oh, you shouldn't have a third car garage. Or if you have a storage unit, I'm like, you might have a great reason, okay? But listen, we just have this thought process as a culture and we live, this is the water we swim in. This is the water. We don't even know it's grabbing a hold of our hearts. And it's grabbing a hold of mine too. It grabs a hold of our hearts. We're constantly thinking about retirement. And what does that look like? To take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. I think every person in this room has probably at some point imagined, what would I do if I won the lottery? You know? Like, oh, when that number hits that ridiculously high figure or whatever, and you're like, what would I do if I won the lottery? A lot of it would look like this: take life easy, eat, drink, be merry. We think that's the end goal. We think that's the target. This is a message for us, that what Jesus is saying here. Verse 20, God said to him, this man, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" Here's the thing: materialism never delivers on its promises. The God of money or stuff, possessions, it never delivers on its promises. And we all know this. I mean, we know this at some level. We've experienced this. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves of this. There is sort of a dopamine hit sometimes that can happen when you click that buy button, like buy now. You're like, oh, it'll be here in 12 hours? We are an immediate, we seek immediate gratification in our culture, and we're getting more and more of it. There is something with that, but then when it comes, it's like that fades very quickly, doesn't it? I mean, it's just like in anything else, like I said before, like anything that is promising to satisfy, but it's not God, it doesn't in the end, and you find yourself out seeking more. There's also this idea called hedonic adaptation, okay? So hedonism, like it's the idea of constantly bringing yourself joy or pleasure. Hedonic adaptation, it's the idea that when something good happens to you, or something good, you buy something good, or you experience something good, or you get a pay raise, or whatever it might be, like there's an immediate like heightening of, oh yeah, that's great, of happiness or joy or whatever, a sense of that anyway. It's probably not true joy, but it's some kind of happiness feeling, or dopamine hit or whatever. But then over time, whether that be a day or an hour or a week or a month or even a year, you kind of return back to that standard level of happiness that you were at before. It doesn't like long-term change the outlook. Even very major good things that can happen to you. There's hedonic adaptation. You end up back at the average, at the place where you started in terms of your mentality about things. So like it might look like, hey, I got the new iPhone, it's awesome, this is the coolest phone I've ever owned. And then like 6 months later, there's 2 other editions that have come out since then. You're like, yeah, my phone's okay. I've got a phone, it's all right. I got a new car and it's amazing. And then, you put some miles on it, steering gets a little bit loose, whatever. You're like, I got a car, it's all right, it works. Gets me from A to B. Like we have this mentality and this tendency to go back to the mean when it comes to our satisfaction with life. Material does not deliver on its promises. We never arrive. We're constantly pursuing the next thing. And then at the end of life, who will get what you've prepared for yourself? It's all temporary, right? That at the end of the day, that's really Jesus' perspective, is that what we see is temporary. It doesn't last into eternity. Verse 21, he summarizes the whole story. He says, "This is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." This is how it'll be for everyone who stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. This is far from the only place this idea of being rich toward God is discussed in the New Testament. We'll see a lot more examples of that. We'll talk a little bit more about that, what that really means. But I think Jesus' point at the end of the day, and this is sort of the bottom line, is that the good life, as our world, as our culture defines it, the good life is not really the good life. The good life as our world would define it, the good life as we think of it, whatever we imagine, just as Americans or Westerners, as we think about that, is not really the good life that God has in mind for us. What he has is so much better, so much greater. Paul, talking to his protege Timothy in 1 Timothy 6:19, he's instructing Timothy how to lead some people in his church and how to teach them. And he addresses people in Timothy's congregation who are wealthy. And he talks to them again about this idea of being rich toward God, of laying up treasures in heaven. And he's talking about doing that by encouraging them not to put their hope in wealth and to be rich in good deeds and to be generous with what God has blessed them with. And he concludes this thought. We will be back in 1 Timothy 6 throughout the course of this series, but he concludes this thought in this way. Paul says, they will lay up treasure for themselves, In what way? By being rich in good deeds and by being generous with what God has given them. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. I think that's really the same thought that Jesus is trying to say. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. It consists in something totally different. And Paul is saying, as they're generous and as they are rich in good deeds, they will be able to take hold of a life that is truly life. I think what our world is searching for, what we are searching for, what I'm searching for, is life that is truly life. That's what everyone is after. And the issue is we get distracted about where can we find that life. Where can we find that life as we walk through our time in this world, which is temporary, but our lives will go on beyond it. So what we are really after is life that is truly life. We're just trying to find that sometimes in the world's methods. Even when we have faith in a relationship with Jesus, sometimes we're still trying to find that through the world's methods. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions, but it consists in a relationship with God and what it looks like to live for Him. When we have a relationship with God that's flourishing, we get to experience purpose, we get to experience satisfaction, we get to experience hope for the future, we get to experience a security that's not based on how the market performed today. We get to experience all sorts of things. And then we get to experience life that stretches into eternity that can never be taken, that's kept in heaven for us, where we can be together with our Savior. As we walk through this series, we're just going to look a little bit more at our possessions, at wealth, at how these things in our world can get a hold of our hearts. And ultimately, when it comes to talking about finances, talking about possessions in the church setting, people can get squeamish, and I completely understand why it's an uncomfortable conversation. Because there have been many times where that's been abused, where these kinds of conversations have been abused in church settings and all over our world, not just in the church, but in the church as well. But at the end of the day, Jesus makes it clear throughout His teaching that our heart as it relates to finances, as it relates to possessions, this is a discipleship issue. This is a worship of God issue. And so we'll talk more about this. This is not some kind of a series to try to raise the giving here at Oak Point Canton. That has nothing to do with this. There's absolutely nothing to do with this. And I'll give you an out later on as we talk about generosity, where honestly, it does not make a difference to me whether or not the giving or the generosity impacts Oak Point Canton at all. Just that you're allowing God to have more of your heart by surrendering to Him in every area of life, including this one, because it has such a tendency to grab hold of our hearts. Always has, and will continue to in the future more and more and more. And it's a false gospel. It will not bring us the satisfaction, the fullness, the completeness, the security, or even the comfort that we are seeking within it. Only one person can provide those things for us, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more in just a minute. We're going to take a time of reflection here as we think about this area, and there's a song that's called "My Worth Is Not in What I Own." And this is a counter-formation song. It helps us because we hear and we sing so many songs that have to do with this material world that we are living in, with gathering things, with putting our hope and our trust and our satisfaction and our comfort and getting all that from things in our world. But at the end of the day, this is a counter-formation song because it points us to the one thing that can truly provide all of that for us. It reminds us that our life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. So we're going to hear this song. You can just stay seated. This is probably, for many of us, the first time you've heard this. We're going to continue to sing this song. This will not be the last time you hear it during the course of this series. And then we're going to do communion. We're going to just put our faith and fix our eyes on the Savior, on the one who can provide all the things that money promises to us but does not deliver. Let's pray. Jesus, we just think about this area that you spoke so much about and just gave us so many great thoughts to combat the culture around us. Lord, would you just help us to have a heart attitude of surrender toward you? that we would not close off this area of our lives, but that we would want what you want for us, which is the best thing for us, which is a love for you and a heart that's not divided. So, Lord, for every single person in this room, whether as an individual you have blessed us with much or with little, Lord, may we be grateful to you. May we be satisfied only in you, not by what we have or desiring what we don't have. May we get our purpose and our security and our value from you alone. My worth is not.